The world tasted of grit. Eleanor coughed, a rasping sound lost in the wind's mournful howl. Caleb, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and squint lines, gently shifted her weight. Her head lolled, the bonnet askew, revealing a tangle of auburn hair caked with dust. The stagecoach lay on its side, a shattered husk of wood and leather, wheels spinning uselessly in the dirt. A dust devil, a swirling dervish of brown had passed, leaving its chaotic signature etched across the barren landscape. He'd been tracking a stray heifer when he saw the plume of dust against the horizon. Instinct, honed by years on the unforgiving plains, told him something was amiss. He'd spurred his horse, a dun-colored Mustang named Whiskey, pushing him hard across the cracked earth. Now kneeling beside Eleanor, he felt the cold dread that always accompanied the aftermath of disaster. She moaned, a thin, reedy sound. Caleb reached for his canteen, uncorking it with a practiced hand. He dribbled a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. She swallowed weakly, her eyelids fluttering. "Easy now," he rasped, his voice a low rumble, rarely used and rough around the edges. He didn't waste words. Never had. Eleanor's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then widening with a dawning horror. She clutched at something in her hand, a torn photograph. Caleb could see the faded image of a man, a woman, and 3 small children, their faces blurred by time and damage. "The children," she whispered, her voice choked with dust and despair. Caleb scanned the wreckage, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Nothing. Just the twisted metal, splintered wood, and the relentless wind whispering across the empty plains. He found the driver a few yards away, thrown clear of the coach. Lifeless. Dust coated his open eyes, mirroring the vast, indifferent skeet. Caleb knew this land. It didn't offer mercy. It demanded resilience. And right now, Eleanor was teetering on the edge. He gently pried the photograph from her grasp. The image was a stark reminder of what she'd lost, or perhaps what she was trying to protect. He tucked it carefully into his vest pocket, close to his heart. Some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. He lifted her, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man built like granite. He placed her on Whiskey, settling her as comfortably as he could against the saddle. "We're going," he said, his voice firm but low. "Hold on." He led Whiskey eastward, away from the wreckage, away from the ghosts that swirled in the dust. The sun beat down mercilessly. The air shimmered with heat. He knew the nearest ranch was a hard day's ride, maybe more, depending on Eleanor's strength. He didn't know her story, didn't know where she was going, or what she was running from. But he knew the look in her eyes, the desperate hope clinging to the edge of despair. He'd seen it before, etched on the faces of homesteaders battling drought, of families fleeing Comanche raids, of souls broken free by the relentless hardship of the West. As they rode, Eleanor remained silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The photograph, tucked safely away, seemed to offer a fragile anchor in the swirling chaos of her life. Caleb watched her, his silence a form of respect, a tacit acknowledgement of her plight. He knew that some wounds couldn't be healed with words. Sometimes all a person needed was a steady hand and a silent promise of protection. And that he could provide. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and furry oranges. Eleanor shivered, despite the thick wool blanket Caleb had draped over her. The small cabin, a single room constructed of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud, offered little respite from the desert chill. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of wood smoke and fever. She tossed and turned on the narrow cayuse, muttering incoherently. Caleb sat beside her, his gaze straight, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the oil lamp. Shadows danced on the walls, transforming familiar objects into grotesque shapes. He dipped a clean cloth in a basin of cool water and gently dabbed her forehead. Her skin was hot, dry to the touch. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Just rest." Her ramblings were fragments of a life unknown to him. He heard snippets of children's names, Jane, Peter, Little Beth, mixed with pleas and desperate pronouncements. "No, please, I'll find the money. Don't take them." The words painted a grim picture, a story of hardship and desperation that resonated with the stories etched into the very land around them. He peeled back the blanket, checking her for injuries beyond the obvious bumps and bruises from the stagecoach wreck. Beneath the layers of dust-caked linen, he saw the faintest glimpse of silky silk. A camisole, trimmed with delicate lace, peeked from beneath her travel-worn dress. The fabric was fine, almost impossibly so, a stark contrast to the rough-spun practicality of everything else in his world. And, he suspected, everything she'd encountered since the wreck. He'd seen silk like that once before, years ago. On Sarah, his Sarah, before the fever took her, leaving him with nothing but a hollow ache and the dust devils that seemed to mock his solitude. He quickly covered Eleanor again, the brief glimpse of luxury a jarring reminder of a life lost, a life he could never reclaim. He knew nothing of this woman, but the sight of that silk suggested a past far removed from the harsh realities of the West. It made him wonder what circumstances had driven her to this point, what desperation had forced her on to that ill-fated stagecoach. He rose and walked to the small window, peering out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, howling like a banshee across the plains. The only light came from the sliver of a moon, hanging low in the sky. He could hear the coyotes calling in the distance, their mournful cries echoing his own unspoken sorrow. He thought of Sarah, of her laughter, of the way she used to hum while she sewed. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the warmth of her smile. All gone now, swallowed by the unforgiving landscape. He turned back to Eleanor, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He knew what it was like to lose everything. He knew the pain of watching someone you loved slip away. And he knew that sometimes the only thing you could do was offer a hand, a silent promise of support, and hope that it was enough. He returned to her side, re-wetting the cloth and gently dabbing her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. He worried about the fever, about what it might do to her mind. He had some willow bark tea brewing on the stove, a remedy his grandmother had taught him, but he wasn't sure if she was strong enough to swallow it. He sat there, watching her, listening to her fevered whispers, a silent sentinel, guarding her fragile life. The photograph, still tucked safely in his vest pocket, seemed to pulse with a silent energy, a reminder of the lives that depended on her, the lives she was fighting to protect. He closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer to a God he rarely spoke to, a prayer for strength, for guidance, and for a little bit of mercy in a world that seemed to offer so little. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Eleanor stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Caleb, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "Water?" she croaked, her voice weak and raspy. He helped her to sit up, supporting her with a strong arm. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank slowly, gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze meeting his. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, his silence a tacit acknowledgement. He didn't need her gratitude. He did what he had to do. It was the way of the West. It was the way he'd always lived. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something more than just gratitude. He saw a spark of hope, a flicker of resilience that refused to be extinguished. And in that moment, he knew that she would survive. She would find a way to carry on, to protect those children in the photograph. And maybe, just maybe, in helping her, he could find a small measure of redemption for the loss he had suffered so long ago. The West was a harsh mistress, but sometimes, in the most unexpected places, you could find a glimmer of grace. The dawn painted the cabin walls in soft strokes of rose and amber. Eleanor, propped against a rolled-up blanket, sipped the water Caleb offered, her hand trembling slightly. The fever had broken, leaving her weak, but lucid. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes lingering on the rough-hewn logs, the simple furnishings. A far cry, Caleb surmised, from wherever she'd come from. Chicago, she murmured, the word a fragile whisper, carried on the morning air. I remember Chicago. Caleb remained silent, his gaze steady, unwavering. He knew that sometimes the most helpful thing you could do was simply listen. Let a person unravel their story at their own pace. He'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago, trying to force Sarah to talk about her nightmares. Eleanor's gaze drifted, unfocused, as if she were looking at something beyond the cabin walls, something only she could see. The Drake Hotel, the debutante balls, waltzes that went on until dawn. She shivered despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. It all seems like a dream now, a faded, impossible dream. She closed her eyes, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Caleb offered her a bowl of thin gruel, made from ground corn and water. Simple sustenance, but all he had to offer. "You need to eat," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Gain back your strength." She took the bowl, her fingers brushing against his. Her touch was surprisingly delicate, a stark contrast to the grit and grime that clung to everything in this harsh land. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if each spoonful was a victory against the despair that threatened to engulf her. As she ate, she continued to speak, her voice a low, almost hypnotic drone. "My father, he was a good man, a generous man. He left me a considerable inheritance." Her voice cracked and she paused, swallowing hard. "It was supposed to be for my children, to secure their future." Caleb watched her, his expression unreadable. He'd heard stories like this before. Stories of stolen fortunes, of broken promises, of lives ruined by greed and betrayal. The West was full of them. "It was taken from me," she continued, her voice rising slightly, a hint of anger flashing in her eyes. "All of it, by a man I trusted, a man who swore he loved me." She looked down at the bowl, her gaze fixed on the swirling pattern of the gruel. "I had to leave. I had to get my children away from him. He would have used them as leverage to control me." Caleb understood. He may not have known the specifics of her situation, but he understood the instinct to protect, the desperation to keep your loved ones safe. He'd felt that same desperation when the fever swept through his ranch, threatening to take Sarah from him. "I was heading to California," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have a sister there. She promised to help me, to give us a new start." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "But now I don't know what to do. The stagecoach, everything is gone. I have nothing left." Caleb placed a hand on her arm, his touch firm and reassuring. "You're alive," he said, his voice low and steady. "That's more than most folks have out here. You're alive, and you have your children. That's all that matters." He saw in her eyes the same haunted look that followed him, the look of someone who had lost everything, who had been stripped bare by the cruel realities of life. He knew that look well. He saw it every time he looked in the mirror. He rose and walked to the stove, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He needed the caffeine to sharpen his focus. He had a decision to make. He could leave her here, give her some supplies, and send her on her way. It was the practical thing to do, the safe thing to do. But he couldn't. He couldn't turn his back on her, Not when he saw that flicker of hope still burning in her eyes. He knew what it was like to be alone, to be adrift in a world that seemed determined to crush you. He wouldn't wish that on any, especially not on a woman trying to protect her children. He turned back to Eleanor, his face etched with a newfound resolve. "You said you were going to California?" he asked, his voice firm. She nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. "I'm heading that way myself," he said. "Got some business to take care of in Sacramento. I can take you and your children with me." A wave of relief washed over Eleanor's face, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Caleb shook his head. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Just focus on getting better. And on taking care of those children." He knew that taking her with him was a risk. He didn't know anything about her past, about the Maori she was running from. He didn't know if he was walking into a trap, if he was inviting trouble into his life. But he didn't care. He couldn't stand by and watch her struggle. He had to help her, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He looked at the photograph, still tucked safely in his vest pocket. The faded image of the children seemed to beckon him, to plead with him for help. He knew that he was doing the right thing. He was giving those children a chance to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf them. And maybe, just maybe, in helping them, he could find a little bit of light in his own life, a little bit of redemption for the loss he had offered so long ago. Caleb started packing, his movements economical and precise. He gathered dried meat, flour, and beans, the staples of a long journey. He checked Whiskey's saddle, ensuring the cinch was tight, and the saddlebags were securely fastened. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a man accustomed to providing for himself, relying on no one. Eleanor watched him, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. She was still weak, but the color had returned to her cheeks. She'd managed to wash her face and hands in the basin of water, scrubbing away some of the grime of the journey. Her auburn hair, though still tangled, shone with a faint glimmer in the morning light. "Where are we going exactly?" she asked, her voice stronger now, but still tinged with a trace of apprehension. "Sacramento is a long way. What kind of business do you have there?" Caleb paused, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to face her. He wasn't used to explaining himself, to sharing his plans with anyone. But he knew that if he was going to take her with him, she deserved to know something about him, about his life. "I have some land there," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "A small ranch. I raise cattle, mostly for beef. I need to sell some head, settle some debts." He didn't elaborate. He didn't mention the years of hard work, the endless hours spent under the scorching sun, of the constant struggle against drought and disease. He didn't mention the loneliness, the emptiness that had haunted him since Sarah's death. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "That's all you need to know." Eleanor nodded, understanding that he wasn't going to offer any more information. She respected his privacy, his need to keep his own counsel. She had secrets of her own, after all. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice low and serious. "About the photograph." Caleb raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Eleanor reached into her pocket, pulling out the torn photograph. She smoothed it out with her fingers, her gaze lingering on the faded image. "This is my brother, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and his children." Caleb studied the photograph, his gaze drawn to the faces of the children. They were young, innocent, their eyes filled with a carefree joy that seemed so distant from the harsh realities of the West. "He's in trouble," Eleanor continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "Terrible trouble." She paused, taking a deep breath to compose herself. "He's been accused of murder. In Chicago, a man was found dead in his office. Thomas was arrested, charged with the crime. Caleb remained silent, his expression unchanged. He'd seen injustice before. He'd witnessed the power of wealth and influence to corrupt the legal system. He knew that innocent men were sometimes condemned, while the guilty went free. "He's innocent," Eleanor insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I know he is. He would never hurt anyone." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes pleading. "But the evidence, it's all circumstantial. And the man who's prosecuting him, he's a ruthless, ambitious politician. He sees this case as a way to advance his career." She paused, swallowing hard. "I fled Chicago to clear his name," she confessed. "I had evidence that could prove his innocence. But I needed to get it to the right people who would listen." She looked down at the photograph, her gaze filled with despair. "But the journey, it was too dangerous. I lost everything. The evidence, it's gone." Caleb listened to her story, his face etched with a growing understanding. He knew what it was like to fight for someone you loved, to risk everything for their sake. He'd done it himself years ago, when Sarah was sick. He'd traveled miles, seeking out the best doctors, the most effective remedies. He'd spent all his savings, mortgaged his ranch, all in a desperate attempt to save her life. He knew the pain of losing that fight. He knew the bitterness of regret, the gnawing feeling that he could have done more. "I understand," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I understand what you're going through." He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his vest pocket, pulling out the photograph. He held it out to her, his gaze meeting her. "Keep this," he said. "It's important to remember what you're fighting for." Eleanor took the photograph, her fingers trembling. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me." Caleb nodded, his silence a tacit acknowledgement. He didn't know if he believed her story completely. He didn't know if her brother was truly innocent. But he believed in her. He believed in her determination, her loyalty, her unwavering love for her family. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own pain, his own loss. He saw a kindred spirit, someone who had been wounded by life, but who refused to be broken. He thought of his own brother, Daniel. They hadn't been close, not really. Daniel had been restless, always seeking adventure, always chasing after fool's gold. He'd ended up in a mining camp in Nevada, drawn by the promise of riches. He'd been killed in a dispute over a claim, shot in the back by a rival miner. Caleb had traveled to Nevada to bring his brother's body home. He'd stood by his grave, feeling a profound sense of loss, not just for Daniel, but for the life they could have had together, the bond that had been broken by greed and violence. He knew that Eleanor was fighting to prevent a similar tragedy. She was fighting to save her brother's life, to keep his children from being orphaned. He couldn't stand by and watch her fail. He made a decision. He would help her. He would use his resources, his connections, to find the evidence she needed to clear her brother's name. He would do whatever it took to bring justice to her family. He looked at Eleanor, his face etched with a newfound resolve. "We'll get you to California," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find your sister. And then we'll figure out how to help your brother." Eleanor's eyes widened, her face lighting up with hope. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb nodded. "I mean it," he said. "We'll do it together." A fragile smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Together," she repeated. The word a promise, a lifeline in the vast, unforgiving landscape. She clutched the photograph, the faces of her brother and his children seeming to glow with renewed hope. Caleb turned away, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. The sun was climbing higher, baking the earth, promising another day of relentless heat. They needed to leave soon, before the worst of it set in. "If you're serious about this journey," he said, his voice gruff, "you'll need to learn to ride." Eleanor's smile faltered. She glanced down at her city clothes, a travel-worn dress of pale blue cotton, thin-soled leather boots, utterly unsuitable for the rigors of the trail. She'd never ridden a horse in her life, save for a brief, carefully controlled jaunt in a park carriage. The idea of spending days, perhaps weeks, in the saddle filled her with a daunting mix of apprehension and determination. I don't know how," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "I've never—" Caleb cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Doesn't matter. You'll learn. We don't have time for delicate sensibilities out here. It's ride or walk. And walking's a death sentence." He retrieved a sturdy, well-worn pair of leather chaps from the corner of the cabin. They were his old pair, patched and softened with years of use. "These'll help protect your legs, and find some sturdier boots. Those things you're wearing won't last a day." Eleanor took the chaps, her fingers tracing the worn leather. They smelled of horse, of sweat, of the open range, a foreign, almost overwhelming scent. She felt a surge of panic, a desire to retreat back to the safety of the cabin, to the familiar comforts of her old life. But she quickly suppressed it. She couldn't afford to be afraid. She had to be strong, for her brother, for his children. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. "I'll learn to ride." Caleb nodded, a flicker of something akin to approval in his eyes. He led her outside, to where Whiskey stood patiently tethered to a hitching post. The horse was a magnificent creature, a sturdy, muscular bay, with intelligent, watchful eyes. He dwarfed Eleanor, making her feel even smaller, even more vulnerable. "This is Whiskey," Caleb said. His hand rested on the horse's flank. "He's a good horse, but he's got a mind of his own. Treat him with respect, and he'll treat you the same." He showed her how to approach the horse, how to speak to him in a calm, soothing voice. He explained the basics of saddling and bridling, his instructions clear and concise. Eleanor listened intently, her mind racing stiff, trying to absorb everything he was telling her. Then came the hard part. Getting on. Caleb showed her how to place her foot in the stirrup, how to swing her leg over the saddle. The first few attempts were clumsy, awkward. She struggled to maintain her balance, her muscles screaming in protest. "Easy now," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly patient. "Don't fight him. Let him carry you." He steadied her, his hand firm on her arm. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to relax, to trust the horse. She finally managed to swing her leg over the saddle, settling into a precarious, uncomfortable position. "Now what?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "Now you ride," Caleb said, his expression unreadable. He led Whiskey out into the open, the horse moving with a slow, deliberate gait. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her body rigid with fear. The first few minutes were agonizing. Every movement of the horse sent jolts of pain through her body. She felt as if she were going to be thrown off at any moment. But slowly, gradually, she began to find her rhythm. She learned to anticipate the horse's movements, to adjust her balance, to relax her grip. She rode for hours, under the scorching sun, her muscles burning, her skin chafing. She fell repeatedly, landing hard on the dusty ground. Each time, Caleb helped her up, offering a few words of encouragement, a few tips on how to improve her technique. He didn't coddle her. He didn't offer false praise. He simply pushed her, challenging her to overcome her fears, to push beyond her limits. And Eleanor did. She surprised herself with her own resilience, her own determination. She discovered a grit within herself that she never knew else existed. She was no longer the pampered socialite from Chicago. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman willing to do whatever it took to protect her family. As the sun began to set, painting the ski in hues of orange and purple. Caleb called a halt. Eleanor dismounted, her legs trembling, her body aching. She could barely stand. "You did good," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You've got a long way to go, but you're learning." Eleanor looked at him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. She knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous. She knew that she would face many more challenges, many more setbacks. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Caleb by her side, a silent, stoic protector, a man who had seen the darkness and had chosen to fight against it. And she had Whiskey, a loyal, steadfast companion, a creature of strength and grace. She reached out and stroked the horse's nose, her fingers tracing the soft velvet of his muzzle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for carrying me." She looked out at the vast open landscape, the endless expanse of the American West. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, a land that tested the limits of human endurance. But it was also a land of breathtaking beauty, a land of endless possibilities. And Eleanor knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that she would survive. She would overcome whatever obstacles lay in her path. She would find a way to clear her brother's name, to bring his children to safety. She would become a true Western woman, strong, resilient, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. And she would do it, not just for her family, but for herself. She would reclaim her life, her identity, her future. She would forge a new path, a path of her own making, in this wild, unbound land. The stars wheeled across the inky sky, a silent, glittering display that offered little comfort. Eleanor, exhausted from her first day of riding, slept fitfully inside the cabin, her dreams likely haunted by the past she was trying so desperately to escape. Caleb sat by the dying embers of the campfire, his rifle resting across his knees, his senses on high alert. He hadn't expected to find trouble so soon. He'd hoped for a few days of peace, a chance to get Eleanor and her children settled, before facing whatever storm was brewing behind her. A twig snapped in the darkness, and Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle. He didn't need to see who it was. He knew the sound of Jedediah's approach. The old tracker moved like a ghost, his feet barely disturbing the undergrowth, his presence almost imperceptible. Jedediah emerged from the shadows, his face etched with the lines of a hard life spent under the open skillway. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held a spark of keen intelligence, a knowledge of the land and its dangers that few possessed. He carried a worn leather pouch slung over his shoulder, and a gnarled walking stick in his hand. "Evening, Caleb," Jedediah rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "Jedediah," Caleb replied, his voice low. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." Jedediah grunted, settling down on a nearby log. "Heard tell you had company. Figured you might want to know what's blowing in on the wind." Caleb remained silent, waiting for the old tracker to elaborate. Jedediah had a way of circling around the point, of drawing out the suspense like a patient fisherman, reeling in a stubborn catch. "Riders," Jedediah finally said, his gaze fixed on the embers of the fire. "4 of them, heading west, asking questions about a woman. Auburn hair, travel-worn, with young'uns in tow." Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd known it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for Eleanor. He just hadn't expected them to arrive so quickly. "Hired guns," Jedediah continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mean-looking bunch. The kind that don't ask twice." He paused, his gaze shifting to Caleb. "They're from Chicago, and they ain't just looking to bring her home." Caleb felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew that Eleanor was running from something dangerous, but he hadn't realized just how dangerous. Hired guns from Chicago meant serious trouble, powerful enemies with deep pockets and a willingness to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Who sent them? Caleb asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jedediah shook his head. Don't know for sure, but I heard whispers. Names I ain't never heard before. Names that carry weight. Names that could make a man disappear. He reached into his leather pouch, pulling out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He held it out to Caleb. Found this trailside, near where they camped. Chicago-made, I reckon. Caleb took the bird, turning it over in his hands. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, delicate and refined. It seemed out of place in this rugged, unforgiving land, a symbol of a world of wealth and privilege that stood in stark contrast to the harsh realities of the West. They're serious, Caleb, Jedediah said, his voice grave. They ain't gonna stop until they find her. Caleb knew that Jedediah was right. These men weren't going to give up easily. They were relentless, driven by a powerful force that Caleb couldn't even begin to comprehend. He thought of Eleanor, sleeping peacefully inside the cabin, oblivious to the danger that was closing in and around her. He thought of her children, innocent and vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of a battle they didn't understand. A wave of protectiveness washed over him, a fierce determination to keep them safe, no matter the cost. But he also felt a flicker of doubt, a nagging question that he couldn't ignore. Was he doing the right thing by involving himself in her troubles? Was he putting himself and his ranch in danger for a woman he barely knew? He thought of sending her away, of giving her some supplies and pointing her in the direction of the nearest town. It would be the safest thing to do, the most practical thing to do. He could wash his hands of the whole situation, avoid the risky and the potential consequences. But he couldn't. He couldn't turn his back on her, not when he knew that she was running for her life. He couldn't abandon her children to the wolves. He looked at the wooden bird in his hand, the symbol of a world that was so different from his own. He knew that he was out of his depth, that he was facing enemies that were far more powerful than anything he had ever encountered before. But he also knew that he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had to fight. For Eleanor. For her children. For the values that he held dear. He looked at Jedediah, his face etched with a newfound resolve. Thank you, Jedediah, he said, his voice firm. I appreciate you coming out here to warn me. Jedediah nodded, his gaze unwavering. You be careful, Caleb, he said. This ain't just about a woman. This is about something bigger, something darker. He rose to his feet, his movements slow but steady. I'll keep an eye out for those riders, he said. Let you know if they get any closer. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. Caleb stared into the dying embers of the fire, his mind racing. He knew that he was facing a difficult decision, a choice that could have far-reaching consequences. He could send Eleanor away, protect himself and his ranch, and avoid the danger that was looming on the horizon. Or he could stand by her, fight for her, and risk everything to help her escape her past. He looked at the cabin, the small, humble dwelling that had become a refuge for a woman and her children. He thought of Sarah, of the life they had built together, of the dreams that had been shattered by tragedy. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Eleanor suffer the same fate. He couldn't let her children be orphaned. He had to stand by her, even if it meant putting his own life in danger. He stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He walked to the cabin, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. He opened the door, stepping inside the small, dimly lit space. Eleanor was still asleep, her face pale and drawn. Her children were nestled beside her, their faces serene and peaceful. They looked so innocent, so vulnerable. Caleb stood there for a moment, watching them, his heart filled with a mixture of tenderness and determination. He knew that he was taking a risk, a gamble that could cost him everything. but he also knew that he was doing the right thing. He closed the door softly, his face etched with a newfound resolve. He would protect them, no matter what. He would fight for them, even if it meant facing the darkest forces of the world. He owed it to them. He owed it to Sarah. He owed it to himself. He walked back to the campfire, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. The night was still young, and the shadows were still deep. But Caleb knew that the dawn was coming, and with it, a battle that would test the limits of his courage and his strength. He was ready. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Eleanor, stiff and sore from her first day of riding, emerged from the cabin, eager to stretch her aching muscles. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She found Caleb already up, tending to whiskey, his movements economical and efficient. She approached gingerly, still hesitant in her newfound role as a Western traveler. "Morning," she offered, her voice a little raspy from sleep. Caleb grunted in response, his focus unwavering as he checked Whiskey's hooves. He didn't offer a good morning or any other pleasantry. Talk was a currency he seemed reluctant to spend. Eleanor, unsure of what to do, decided to help. She remembered Caleb's instructions from the previous day and cautiously approached her horse, a gentle mare named Evans he'd assigned to her. Bess was a smaller, gentler animal than Whiskey, but still intimidating to Eleanor. As she reached for the brush, she noticed something that made her pause. Caleb had removed his shirt to better tend to Whiskey, and the morning light revealed a network of scars crisscrossing his back. They were old, faded, but undeniably there, a silent testament to a past she knew nothing about. She stared, transfixed, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of this stoic, self-sufficient rancher with the brutal reality those scars represented. They weren't the jagged wounds of a brawl or an accident. These were deliberate, cruel marks, the kind inflicted by a whip or a lash. Caleb, sensing her gaze, stiffened. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Eleanor quickly averted her eyes, shame flooding her. She hadn't meant to stare, to pry. It felt like a violation, a betrayal of the trust he had extended to her. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." Caleb remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he turned back to Whiskey. He didn't put his shirt back on. It was a silent invitation to ask, or perhaps a challenge. Eleanor hesitated, torn between her curiosity and her desire to respect his privacy, but the image of those scars burned in her mind, demanding an explanation. What happened to you?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. Caleb paused, his hand resting on Whiskey's flank. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to her, a silent statue carved from grief and pain. "The war," he said, his voice low and flat. "It happened during the war." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had assumed he was too young to have fought in the Civil War, but the scars told a different story. "You were a soldier?" she asked, her voice filled with a newfound respect. Caleb shook his head. "Not exactly." He took a deep breath, then continued, his voice still low and devoid of emotion. "I was accused of being a sympathizer, a traitor." Eleanor frowned, confused. "But why?" "My family owned a small farm in Missouri," he explained. "We were caught between the Union and the Confederacy. Both sides demanded our loyalty, our resources. We tried to stay neutral, to help whoever needed it. But in those times, neutrality was seen as treason." He paused, his voice hardening. "A group of Union soldiers came to our farm. They accused us of aiding the rebels. They ransacked our house, stole our livestock, And then they arrested me." He stopped speaking, his silk eyes filled with the pain that Eleanor could almost taste. She could imagine the scene, the chaos, the fear, the injustice. "They held me for months," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They interrogated me, tortured me. They wanted me to confess to crimes I didn't commit. They wanted me to betray my neighbors, my friends." He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were filled with a cold, hard anger that made her flinch. "I didn't," he said, his voice firm. "I refused to give them what they wanted." Eleanor stared at him, her heart aching with compassion. She could see the pain in his eyes, the trauma that still haunted him. "That's when they did that to me," he said, gesturing to his back. "They wanted to break me, to humiliate me. They wanted to make an example of me." He turned away again, his gaze fixed on whiskey. "They released me eventually. They didn't have any proof, any real evidence. But by then, it didn't matter. My life was ruined. My reputation was destroyed. My family, they were gone." He stopped speaking, his voice choked with emotion. Eleanor could see his shoulders trembling. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched, as if expecting another blow. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I had no idea." Caleb didn't respond. He just stood there, his body rigid, his emotions locked away behind a wall of stoicism. Eleanor withdrew her hand, respecting his need for space. She realized that she had misjudged him, that she had seen him as a simple mountain man, a rugged individualist with no past and no attachments. But she had been wrong. He was a man of deep wounds, a man who had suffered greatly, a man who had been scarred by the horrors of war. And yet, despite everything he had endured, he had still found the strength to help her, to offer her and her children a safe haven. He was a man of extraordinary compassion, a man who deserved her respect and her gratitude. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing him not just as a protector, but as a fellow survivor, a kindred spirit who understood the pain of loss and the struggle for survival. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice soft. "I understand now." Caleb finally turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. He didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something akin to warmth in his eyes. "There's a lot you don't understand," he said, his voice low. "But you will. You will." He picked up his shirt and began to put it on, his movements slow and deliberate. Eleanor watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. She knew that she could never fully understand the pain he had endured, but she could try. She could listen to him, support him, and offer him her friendship. And perhaps in time, they could both find a way to heal, to move on from the past, and to build a new future together. She picked up the brush and began to groom Bess, her movements gentle and deliberate. She worked in silence, respecting Caleb's need for space. But she knew that a bond had been forged between them, a bond of shared pain and mutual respect. And she knew that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The vast sky stretched above them, an endless promise, a silent witness to their shared journey, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The fragile peace of dawn shattered with the crack of gunfire. Eleanor, startled awake by the sudden eruption of noise, scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding against her ribs. The children, roused from their sleep, clung to her legs, their eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," she hissed, pushing them back under the covers. "Stay quiet." She grabbed the rifle Caleb had shown her how to load, her hands trembling. She had never fired a gun in her life, save for a few hesitant shots at a tin can. But she knew that she had to protect her children. She crept to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. Figures on horseback were circling the cabin, firing their weapons with reckless abandon. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid tang of fear. Caleb was already outside, taking cover behind a stack of firewood, returning fire with deadly accuracy. His movements were fluid and precise, his face grim and determined. He was a man transformed, a warrior awakened. Eleanor knew that they were under attack, that the hired guns had found them. She had hoped for more time, a chance to escape, but now they were trapped, forced to fight for their lives. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had to be brave, for her children, for Caleb, for herself. She couldn't afford to panic. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, aiming at one of the riders. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely see the target. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle recoiled against her shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through her body. The shot went wild, kicking up dust harmlessly in front of the rider's horse. Caleb glanced at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Get down," he yelled, his voice barely audible above the gunfire. "You'll get yourself killed." But Eleanor ignored him. She knew that she couldn't just hide inside the cabin, cowering in fear. She had to fight, to do her part to defend her family. She reloaded the rifle, her movements clumsy and slow. She aimed again, focusing all her attention on the target. This time she squeezed the trigger more gently, trying to control her breathing. The rifle fired, and the rider yelped, clutching his arm. He swayed in the saddle, then tumbled to the ground. Eleanor stared in disbelief, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had hit him. She had actually hit him. But there was no time to celebrate. More riders were approaching, their faces contorted with anger. They were closing in, their weapons blazing. Caleb was moving quickly, firing his rifle with deadly precision. He dropped another rider, then another. But they were too many, their numbers overwhelming. "We need to get out of here," Caleb yelled, his voice strained. "They're gonna overrun us." He grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her towards the back of the cabin. "There's a tunnel," he said, his voice urgent. "It leads to the creek. We can use it to escape." Eleanor hesitated. She didn't want to leave, to abandon the cabin, but she knew that Caleb was right. They couldn't stay here and fight. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. She grabbed the children, pulling them towards the back of the cabin. Caleb kicked open a loose floorboard, revealing a dark, narrow opening. "Go," he yelled, pushing Eleanor towards the tunnel. "I'll cover you." Eleanor squeezed through the opening, followed by the children. The tunnel was cramped and claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. She could hear the gunfire raging above them, the shouts of the riders, the screams of the wounded. She crawled forward, the children clinging to her back. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in around her. She could feel the fear rising in her throat, threatening to choke her. But she kept moving, driven by the need to protect her children. She had to get them to safety, no matter the cost. Finally, she saw a light at the end of the tunnel. She crawled towards it, her heart pounding with hope. She emerged into the cool, fresh air, finding herself on the banks of a small creek. Caleb was right behind her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He scanned the surrounding area, his eyes narrowed. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice urgent. "They'll be looking for us." He led them along the creek, moving quickly and quietly. They waded through the shallow water, their feet sinking into the muddy bottom. The children were exhausted and scared, but they kept going, driven by the fear of what might happen if they stalled. They walked for hours, until the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. They found a small clearing, hidden among the trees. Caleb stopped, his gaze sweeping across the surrounding landscape. "We can rest here for a while," he said, his voice low. "But we can't stay for long." Eleanor collapsed onto the ground, her body aching with exhaustion. The children huddled beside her, their faces pale and drawn. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. He had saved their lives, risked his own safety to protect them. She didn't know what she would have done without him. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his rifle resting in his hands, a silent guardian watching over them. The reality of their situation hung heavy in the air. They had escaped the initial assault, but they were far from safe. The hired guns were still out there, searching for them, and they wouldn't give up easily. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. But they were alive, and as long as they were alive, there was hope. She looked at her children, their faces etched with fear and fatigue. She knew that she had to be strong. For them, she had to find a way to protect them, to lead them to safety. She would do whatever it took, even if it meant facing the darkest forces of the world. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The silence was broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek and the distant calls of birds. But beneath the surface of tranquility, a storm was brewing. The ambush had failed to kill them, but it had ignited a fire within Eleanor, a fierce determination to survive, to protect her family, and to seek justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that she would not rest until they were safe, until the hired guns were brought to justice, and until she could finally find peace in this wild, untamed land. The West demanded resilience, and she would answer. Caleb didn't waste time on platitudes. He knew they were running on borrowed time. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, his grip surprisingly gentle despite the urgency. "Canyon's our only chance," he rasped, his gaze fixed on the rugged landscape rising before them. The canyon loomed, a jagged scar carved into the earth, its walls a tapestry of red rock and scrub brush. It offered concealment, but also danger. One wrong step, one loose rock, and they could find themselves tumbling into the abyss. Eleanor didn't argue. The furor that had gripped her moments before had solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She glanced at her children, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. "We can do this," she whispered, more to reassure herself than them. Caleb led the way, his movements sure-footed and swift. He knew this canyon like the back of his hand, every crevice, every hidden path. He moved with a grace that belied his size, his body adapting to the uneven terrain with an almost preternatural ease. Eleanor followed close behind, struggling to keep pace. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she pushed herself onward, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to protect her children. The children, bless their hearts, did their best to keep up. They stumbled and cried, but they didn't complain. They knew that their lives depended on their silence, on their ability to endure. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, the distant crack of gunfire, the thud of hooves on the rocky ground. The hired guns were relentless, driven by a single-minded purpose. They wouldn't stop until they had found them, until they had silenced them for good. Caleb led them deeper into the canyon, navigating a treacherous maze of narrow passages and steep inclines. The walls rose high above them, blocking out the sun, casting long, eerie shadows. The air grew cooler, the silence more profound. He paused, pressing a finger to his lips, signaling for them to stop. He listened intently, his head cocked to one side. "They're close," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're splitting up, trying to flank us." Eleanor's heart sank. They were being hunted, cornered like animals. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, threatening to overwhelm her. But Caleb wouldn't allow it. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "We're not done yet," he said, his eyes filled with determination. "We're gonna make it through this." He pointed to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, almost invisible to the naked eye. "There's a cave up there," he said. "It's small, but it'll offer some cover. We can make Cowboy stand there." Eleanor nodded, her fear momentarily replaced by a surge of hope. A cave, a place to hide, a chance to fight back. Caleb helped her and the children scramble up the steep incline, his strength unwavering. He hoisted them one by one, his muscles straining, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, they reached the cave. It was small and wimpy, barely large enough to accommodate them all. But it was a haven, a sanctuary in the midst of chaos. Caleb positioned himself at the entrance, his rifle raised, his gaze fixed on the canyon below. He was a sentinel, a protector, a force to be reckoned with. Eleanor huddled with the children in the back of the cove, trying to shield them from the impending danger. She felt a surge of gratitude for Caleb, for his strength, his courage, his unwavering commitment to their safety. She had only known him for a short time, but she trusted him implicitly. He was a good man, a man of honor, a man who would do anything to protect those in his care. The sounds of the hired guns grew closer, their voices echoing through the canyon. They were closing in, their footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. Caleb took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight ahead. He knew that the odds were stacked against them. He knew that they were facing a formidable enemy. But he wouldn't back down. He would fight to the death to protect Eleanor and her children. He glanced back at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and resolve. "Stay here," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't come out." Eleanor nodded, her heart aching. She knew that he was preparing to sacrifice himself for them. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of being left alone in this wild, unforgiving land. But she also knew that she couldn't stop him. He had made his decision. He was a man of his word. He would do what he had to do. He turned back to the entrance, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. He waited, his senses on high alert, his body coiled like a spring. The first of the hired guns appeared in the canyon below, his face contorted with a cruel smile. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at the cave. Caleb didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot echoing through the canyon, shattering the silence. The hired gun screamed, clutching his chest, then tumbled to the ground. The battle had begun. The canyon walls became a deadly echo chamber, reverberating with gun whir and the cries of the wounded. Eleanor pressed herself against the back of the cave, shielding her children with her body. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, praying for Caleb's safety, praying for their survival. Each shot Caleb fired was a testament to his skill, his accuracy honed by years of living in the unforgiving West. But they were outnumbered, and the canyon offered little in the way of defense. A bullet whizzed past the cave entrance, showering them with rock fragments. Eleanor flinched, pulling the children closer. This couldn't be the end. Through the chaos, she heard Caleb shout, a raw, guttural sound of defiance. He was wounded, she knew it. But he wouldn't yield. He was their shield, their protector, and he would fight until his last breath. And in that moment, Eleanor knew she had to fight too. She had to protect her children, and she had to help Caleb. She was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was a mother, a survivor, and she would do whatever it took to ensure their future. The whispers of trust that had begun to bloom between her and Caleb now solidified into a bond forged in fire, a silent promise to face whatever came, together. Eleanor grabbed the rifle Caleb had shown her how to use. It felt heavy, unwieldy in her hands, but the weight was strangely comforting. It was a tool of survival, a symbol of her newfound resolve. "Stay here," she told the children, her voice firm. "I'm going to help Caleb." She crawled towards the entrance of the cave, peering out into the chaos. The canyon was a maelstrom of gunfire and smoke, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Caleb was still fighting, his movements fluid and precise, but he was clearly wounded. Blood stained his shirt, and he moved with a slight limp. Eleanor took a deep breath and aimed the rifle. Her hands trembled, but she focused on her target, a hired gun who was taking aim at Caleb. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle recoiled against her shoulder. The shot went true, and the hired gun crumpled to the ground. Caleb glanced at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Eleanor, get back!" he yelled. "It's too dangerous." But Eleanor ignored him. She reloaded the rifle and fired again, hitting another hired gun. She was surprised by her own accuracy, her own courage. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a burning determination to protect her family and to help Caleb. Together they fought, a desperate dance of survival against overwhelming odds. They picked off the hired guns one by one, slowly but surely, turning the tide of the battle. Finally, the remaining hired guns retreated, disappearing into the depths of the canyon. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Eleanor and Caleb. Eleanor crawled out of the cave, her legs shaking. She rushed to Caleb's side, examining his wounds. "You're hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. "It's just a scratch," Caleb replied, his voice gruff. "I'll be all right." But Eleanor could see that he was in pain. She helped him back into the cave, where she began to tend to his wounds. "We need to get out of here," Caleb said, his voice strained. "They'll be back." "Where do we go?" Eleanor asked. "There's an old mine shaft a few miles from here," Caleb replied. "It's abandoned, but it'll offer us some shelter." They gathered their meager belongings and set off, Caleb limping slightly as they made their way through the canyon. The children were exhausted, but they trudged onward, their spirits lifted by the fact that they had survived the attack. After several hours of walking, they reached the mine shaft. It was a dark, gaping hole in the side of a hill, surrounded by piles of discarded rock and rusted mining equipment. Caleb led them inside, his movements cautious. The air was cool and damp, and the darkness was almost absolute. "Stay close," he said, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "It's easy to get lost in here." They ventured deeper into the mine shaft, their footsteps echoing through the tunnels. The children clung to Eleanor's legs, their eyes wide with fear. Finally, they reached a small chamber where Caleb lit a lantern. The flickering light revealed a scene of utter desolation. The walls were stained with mineral deposits, and the floor was littered with broken tools and decaying timbers. "We can stay here for the night," Caleb said, his voice weary. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Eleanor nodded, grateful for any kind of shelter. She helped the children settle down, wrapping them in blankets and telling them stories to soothe their fears. Caleb sat by the entrance to the chamber, his rifle resting in his lap. He stared into the darkness, his expression troubled. Eleanor watched him, her heart aching with concern. She knew that something was weighing heavily on his peace. "What's wrong, Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. He paused, his gaze fixed on the floor. "My brother. He didn't die in a dispute, like I told you." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" "He was murdered," Caleb said, his voice low. "He found gold on another man's claim. They killed him for it." Eleanor gasped. "That's terrible," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was ashamed," Caleb replied. "I should have sought justice for him, but I was afraid. I ran away." He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes filled with guilt. "I've been carrying this burden for years," he said. "I never told anyone." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. understood. She saw in him the same desire for justice that burned within her own heart. She knew what it was like to be wronged, to be powerless, to be afraid. "We can find justice for your brother," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We can prove what happened." Caleb looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "You really think so?" he asked. "I know so," Eleanor replied. "We're not alone anymore, Caleb. We have each other." She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a newfound sense of hope. They were bound together by shared pain and a mutual desire for justice. They would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. Caleb's face softened, and a glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me." He leaned forward and gently kissed her forehead, a silent promise of partnership and trust. The children were asleep, their faces peaceful in the flickering lantern light. Eleanor looked at them, her heart swelling with love. She would do anything to protect them, to ensure their future. And she knew that with Caleb by her side, they could overcome any obstacle. The darkness of the mine shaft seemed less oppressive now, filled with the warmth of their shared hope and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The weight of Caleb's gaze settled on Eleanor, a silent question hanging in the damp air of the mine. He saw the conflict etched on her face, the years of hidden burdens finally surfacing. He waited, his hand still clasped in hers, his offering sullen separate as she prepared to speak truths that had festered in the shadows. "The letter," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly. She reached inside her worn dress, retrieving the folded parchment she had carried for so long, a constant reminder of her past. It doesn't exonerate my brother in the way you think." Caleb's brow furrowed. He had assumed the letter contained proof of her brother's innocence, evidence that would clear his name and allow Eleanor to finally find peace. But the tremor in her voice, the haunted look in her eyes, suggested something far more complex. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the letter. "My brother, he didn't steal the money. At least not for himself." She paused, steeling herself for the confession that would honor their fragile peace. "I did." The words hung in the air, heavy and stark. Caleb's grip tightened on her hand, his gaze unwavering. He didn't interrupt, allowing her to unravel the truth in her own time. "There was a family," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Millers, they were starving. Their farm had failed, their crops withered. They were desperate." She closed her eyes, the memory flooding back, vivid and painful. "I knew my brother handled the accounts at the bank. I took the money. Enough to save the Millers, to give them a chance." Caleb's mind raced. He tried to reconcile the image of the woman he was coming to know. Strong, compassionate, fiercely protective, with the act of embezzlement. It was a betrayal of trust, a violation of the law. Yet knowing Eleanor, he sensed there was more to the story. "And your brother?" he prompted gently. "He found out," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "He confronted me. He was furious. He said I had risked everything, that I had jeopardized our family's reputation. He demanded I return the money." She paused, her voice cracking. "He was going to report it. He felt it was the only moral thing to do, regardless of the consequences." Caleb's heart sank. He understood the dilemma. Honor versus compassion. Law versus mercy. It was a choice that could tear a man apart. "And that's when?" he asked, leaving the question unfinished. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's when the truth came out. The Millers, given a second chance, were not grateful recipients of charity. They were greedy. They took the money and used it to expand their holdings, to buy more land, to become wealthy. The irony was bitter, almost unbearable. Eleanor had risked everything to save a family, only to see them prosper from her transgression, while her brother paid the ultimate price. They heard he was going to expose them, she continued, her voice trembling with rage and grief. They knew the scandal would ruin them. So they silenced him. The pieces fell into place, forming a devastating picture of betrayal and injustice. Eleanor hadn't just embezzled money. She had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that led to her brother's murder. Caleb released her hand, stepping back as if burned. He needed a moment to process this revelation, to grapple with the moral complexities it presented. Justice, which had seemed so clear-cut before, now felt like a tangled web of guilt and consequence. He walked to the entrance of the chamber, gazing out into the darkness. The wind howled through the mine shaft, a mournful lament echoing his own turmoil. He had come to help Eleanor find justice for her brother, but now he wasn't sure what justice even meant. The Millers had prospered from a crime, but their prosperity was built on a foundation of desperation and a desperate act of kindness. Eleanor was culpable, yet her motives were rooted in compassion. Her brother was dead, a victim of circumstance and the greed of others. He turned back to Eleanor, his face etched with confusion. What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "I want the truth to be known," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. "I want the Millers to be held accountable for what they did, not just for killing my brother, but for corrupting the very act of kindness that saved them." She stood up, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. "I know I made a mistake," she said. "I know I broke the law, but I won't let my brother's death be in vain. I won't let the Millers get away with their schemes." Caleb looked at her, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He admired her courage, her unwavering commitment to justice, but he also feared the consequences of her actions. Exposing the Millers would mean exposing herself, admitting her own guilt. It could mean prison, ruin, and the loss of everything she held dear. He looked at the sleeping children, their faces innocent and vulnerable. He thought of the life they were trying to build, the future they were hoping to create. Was it worth risking everything for a justice that was so morally ambiguous? He knew, deep down, that he couldn't walk away. He had made a promise to help Eleanor, and he wouldn't abandon her now, not when she needed him the most. He also knew that he couldn't condone the Millers' actions. They had taken advantage of Eleanor's kindness, and they had murdered her brother to protect their ill-gotten gains. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. "All right," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll expose the Millers. We'll find a way to bring them to justice, even if it means facing the consequences ourselves." He reached out and took Eleanor's hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. "But we'll do it together," he said. "We'll face this together, whatever the consequences." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knew that she was asking a lot of him, that she was dragging him into a dangerous and uncertain situation. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed his strength, his courage, and his unwavering loyalty. Together they stood in the darkness of the mine shaft, two wounded souls bound together by a shared desire for justice, ready to face the moral maze that lay ahead. The path would be treacherous, the obstacles formidable, but they were not alone, and as long as they had each other, they had a chance. Caleb stared into the embers of their small fire, the flickering light dancing across his weathered face. He was a mouse of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes. They reflected the harsh realities of the West, the pain of loss, and the unwavering determination to right a wrong, even if it meant facing death itself. "Redemption Gulch," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the mine shaft. "We ride at dawn." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Redemption Gulch. The name itself was a cruel irony. It was the place where her brother had died, where the Millers had prospered, where her life had been irrevocably altered. Returning there was like walking into the lion's den, but she knew she had no choice. She had to face her past, to atone for her mistakes, and to bring the Millers to justice. "It's a suicide mission, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We'll be outnumbered, outgunned. They'll be expecting us." "Maybe," Caleb replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "But they don't know what we're capable of. They don't know how far we're willing to go." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We're not just fighting for justice, Eleanor. We're fighting for our lives. We're fighting for the future of those children." Eleanor looked at her children, sleeping peacefully in the shadows. They were her reason for living, her reason for fighting. She would do anything to protect them, even if it meant sacrificing herself. "I'm with you, Caleb," she said, her voice firm. "We ride at dawn." The first rays of sunlight crept into the mine shaft, casting long, eerie shadows. Caleb and Eleanor saddled their horse, their movements deliberate and efficient. The Fosdy children watched them, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Stay here," Eleanor told them, her voice gentle but firm. "Stay hidden. Don't come out until we return." She kissed them goodbye, her heart aching at the thought of leaving them behind. But she knew it was the only way to keep them safe. Caleb mounted his horse, his rifle resting across his lap. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. He knew the risks they were taking, but he also knew that they were doing the right thing. "Let's ride," he said, his voice low and resolute. They rode out of the mine shaft, their horses kicking up dust as they headed towards Redemption Gulch. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert and mountains. The air was dry and hot, the sun beating down on them mercilessly. As they rode, Caleb told Eleanor about Redemption Gulch, about its history, its people, and its secrets. It was a town built on greed and corruption, where the powerful ruled with an iron fist and the weak were left to fend for themselves. The Millers were the most powerful family in Redemption Gulch, their wealth and influence extending to every corner of the town. "They own the bank, the saloon, the general store," Caleb said, his voice grim. "They control everything. They won't hesitate to use their power to protect themselves." Eleanor listened intently, her mind racing. She knew that they were walking into a hornet's nest, but she was determined to see it through. She had come too far to turn back now. As they approached Redemption Gulch, they saw the town in the distance, a cluster of buildings huddled together in the middle of the desert. It looked like a ghost town, deserted and lifeless. But they knew that beneath the surface, danger lurked. Caleb reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low. "They'll be watching us." They dismounted their horse and approached the town on foot, their movements cautious and stealthy. They stayed close to the shadows, avoiding the main streets. As they neared the center of town, they saw the saloon, its doors swinging open, music and laughter spilling out into the street. It was the heart of Redemption Gulch, the place where deals were made, secrets were traded, and fortunes were won and lost. "The Millers will be there," Caleb said, his voice grim. "That's where we'll find them." They exchanged a look, a silent promise to face whatever came next together. Then, with a shared breath, they stepped out of the shadows and into the heart of Redemption Gulch. The air hung thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the distant clinking of glasses and the faint melody drifting from the saloon. The showdown had begun. The batwing doors of the saloon swung inward, revealing a smoky haze and the raucous din of drunken revelry. Caleb and Eleanor stood silhouetted against the harsh sunlight, their presence instantly silencing the room. All eyes turned to them, sizing them up, assessing the threat they posed. At a table in the corner, surrounded by bodyguards and sycophants, sat Jedediah Miller, the patriarch of the Miller clan. He was a large man, his face etched with years of greed and cruelty, his eyes cold and calculating. He recognized Eleanor immediately, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he regained his composure. Well, Miller drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp. If it isn't Eleanor, come back to pay your respects, have you? Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Miller. I've come for justice, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. For my brother, and for the lives you've ruined. Miller chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Justice? You're the one who broke the law, girl. You stole from my bank. Your brother was just a fool who got in the way. Caleb stepped beside Eleanor, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He was murdered for knowing the truth, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And you're going to pay for it. The saloon erupted in chaos. Chairs were overturned, glasses shattered, and guns were drawn. Miller's bodyguards surged forward, their faces contorted with rage. Get them, Miller roared, his face turning purple with fury. Kill them both. Caleb and Eleanor moved with lightning speed, their guns blazing, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. Caleb's shots were precise and deadly, dropping Miller's men like flies. Eleanor, fueled by righteous anger, fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The gunfight raged on, a desperate dance of survival in the heart of Redemption Gulch. But Caleb and Eleanor were outnumbered, outgunned. They were slowly being pushed back, their ammunition dwindling. Suddenly, a voice boomed above the chaos. Hold it right there! Sheriff Brody, a grizzled lawman with a weary whistle and a steady hand, stepped into the saloon, his shotgun leveled at the combatants. Everyone, drop your weapons, he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. This ends now. The gunfight sputtered to a halt, the combatants reluctantly lowering their weapons. The saloon was a scene of carnage, littered with bodies and debris. Sheriff Brody turned to Caleb and Eleanor, his face grim. I'm going to have to take you in, he said. You're both under arrest. Caleb nodded, his face resigned. He knew that they couldn't win a fight against the intrigued town. Sheriff, Eleanor said, her voice pleading. Miller killed my brother. He needs to be held accountable. Sheriff Brody sighed. I know, Eleanor, he said, but I can't just take your word for it. I need proof. He looked at Miller, who was smirking triumphantly. Jedediah, you and your men are going to come with me to the jail. I need to ask you some questions. Miller scowled, but he knew that he had no choice. He couldn't openly defy the sheriff. Not yet. As they were being led out of the saloon, Caleb caught Miller's eye. This isn't over, he said, his voice a low growl. I'll get justice for my brother, even if it's the last thing I do. Miller just laughed, a cold, heartless sound that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. At the jail, Sheriff Brody locked Caleb and Eleanor in separate cells. He then went to question Miller, leaving his deputy in charge. Hours passed, and Caleb grew increasingly restless. He knew that Miller would try to bribe or intimidate the sheriff, to get him to drop the charges. He had to do something, but he was trapped. Suddenly, he heard a commotion outside his cell. He looked out and saw the deputy lying unconscious on the floor, and Sheriff Brody unlocking his cell door. Let's go, Sheriff Brody said, his voice urgent. I can't hold you here. Miller has too much influence. He'll get you killed. Caleb hesitated. What about Eleanor? He asked. I'll take care of her, Sheriff Brody replied. Just get out of here, go far away and don't come back. Caleb nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. He didn't want to leave Eleanor behind. but he knew that it was the only way to protect her. He followed Sheriff Brody out of the jail and into the night. As they reached the edge of town, Sheriff Brody stopped. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice low. "I questioned Miller. He denied everything, of course, but I saw the fear in his eyes. I know he's guilty, Suesti." He paused, his face etched with sadness. "But Miller, he's a dying man. He's got consumption. The doctor says he only has a few months to live." Caleb was stunned. He had expected to face Miller in a final showdown, to exact his revenge. But now, he was being told that Miller was already dying. "He's being eaten alive by guilt," Sheriff Brody continued. "He confessed to everything. He knows he's going to hell." Caleb felt a strange mix of emotions. He was angry, frustrated, and confused. He had spent years consumed by hatred, only to find that his enemy was already being punished. "What about Eleanor?" he asked. "What are you going to do with her?" Sheriff Brody sighed. "She confessed to embezzling the money. Technically, I'm supposed to take her to Chicago to face charges, but—" He looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let her go. She's suffered enough." Caleb was overwhelmed with gratitude. He didn't know what to say. "Just take care of her," Sheriff Brody said, his voice gruff. "She's a good woman, despite everything." He turned and walked back towards town, leaving Caleb alone in the darkness. Caleb found Eleanor waiting for him at the old mine shaft. She looked pale and exhausted, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Caleb," she exclaimed, rushing into his arms. "What happened? Are you all right?" Caleb held her tight, his heart filled with relief. "I'm all right," he said, "and so are you." He told her everything that had happened, about Miller's illness, about his confession, and about Sheriff Brody's decision to let them go. Eleanor listened in silence, her face a mask of emotions. When he was finished, she stepped back, her eyes filled with tears. "It's over then," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's nothing left to fight for." Caleb took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "There's always something to fight for, Eleanor," he said. "We have each other. And we have the children. We can build a new life, a better life." They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a shared understanding. They had both been through hell, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient. "What about the guilt?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "How do we live with what we've done?" Caleb thought for a moment. "We confess," he said. "We tell our story. We seek forgiveness, from ourselves and from others." And so they did. They traveled to a small town far away from Redemption Gulch, a place where no one knew their past. They found a church, and they confessed their sins to the priest. They told their story to the townspeople, and they asked for forgiveness. To their surprise, they were met with compassion and understanding. The townspeople had all made mistakes in their lives. They knew what it was like to struggle, to suffer, and to seek redemption. Eleanor and Caleb found peace in their new life. They worked hard, they raised their children, and they helped others in need. They never forgot their past, but they didn't let it define them. They had learned that justice and forgiveness were not always mutually exclusive. Sometimes, the greatest act of justice was to forgive, to let go of the past, and to embrace the future. Years later, Caleb and Eleanor sat on their porch, watching the suns. Their children were grown, and they had grandchildren of their own. They were old, but they were happy. "Do you ever think about Redemption Gulch?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft. Caleb nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "but it feels like a lifetime ago." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think we did the right thing, Eleanor," he said. "We found peace and we helped others." Eleanor nodded slowly, the setting sun painting her face in hues of orange and gold. Peace, she echoed, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. For so long peace had seemed an impossible dream, a distant shore shrouded in mist. Now it was within reach, yet incomplete. Chicago, she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Sheriff Brody. He was right. I should go. Face the music. Caleb's jaw tightened, his calloused hand instinctively reaching for hers. The law, he began, his voice a low rumble, but she cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. Not for the law, Caleb, she corrected, her gaze meeting his. For myself. For Thomas. She pulled her hand away, rising from the porch swing. The creaking wood seemed to sigh in agreement with her decision. Running, hiding. It hasn't brought me peace. It's just delayed the reckoning. Caleb watched her, his heart heavy. He understood her need for closure, her desire to atone. But he also knew the risks. Chicago was a long way, a world away from the quiet life they'd built. The law there was harsher, less forgiving than Sheriff Brody. Then I'll go with you, he said, his voice resolute. We face it together, like always. Eleanor smiled, a sad and knowing smile. No, Caleb, she said, shaking her head. This is something I have to do alone. It's my burden to carry. He wanted to argue, to plead, to insist on sharing her burden. But he saw the resolve in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He knew she was right. This was her path, her journey. He couldn't walk it for her. But what about the children? He asked, his voice laced with concern. They'll be safe with you, she replied, her gaze softening as she looked towards the house. You're a good father, Caleb. They need you here. She paused, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for the right words. And I need you to stay here, to keep this dream safe. She was referring to their new life, their small farm, the fragile piece they had carved out of the wilderness. She was asking him to hold on to it, to protect it, while she faced her past. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. I will, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll keep the home fires burning. The next morning, as the sun crested the mountains, Eleanor stood before him, dressed in simple clothes, her face pale but determined. She held a small bite, containing only the bare necessities. I don't know when I'll be back, she said, her voice trembling slightly, or if I'll be back at all. Caleb stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. You will, he said, his voice firm. You're stronger than you think, Eleanor. You'll get through this. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of love, of hope, of farewell. As she turned to leave, Caleb noticed something different about her. A newfound strength, a quiet dignity that had been missing Bowery. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. She was facing her destiny, head held high. He watched as she mounted her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess. She looked back at him one last time, a female gracing her lips. Then she turned the horse and rode away, towards the rising sun. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching her disappear into the distance. A bittersweet ache filled his heart. He knew he might never see her again, but he also knew that she was doing what she had to do, what she needed to do. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Caleb worked the farm, tending to the crops and caring for the children. He missed Eleanor terribly, but he tried to stay strong, for her and for them. He received a letter from her, months later, postmarked Chicago. It was brief, but reassuring. She had confessed, she had faced the judge, and she had been sentenced to a year in prison. It's not so bad, she wrote. The work is hard, but the people are kind, and I have plenty of time to think, to reflect, to heal. She ended the letter with a message of hope. I'll be back, Caleb, she wrote, I promise, and And when I do, I'll be a better woman." Caleb read the letter over and over again, his heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. He knew that Eleanor would keep her promise. She was a survivor, a fighter. She would emerge from this ordeal, stronger than ever. But as the months passed, Caleb began to realize something. Eleanor's true calling wasn't in Chicago, or even on their farm. It was somewhere else, somewhere that would allow her to use her strength, her compassion, and her newfound wisdom to help others. One day, while riding into Redemption Gulch for supplies, Caleb saw a group of children playing in the dirt. They were ragged and dirty, their faces etched with poverty and neglect. They had no school, no books, no hope for a better future. An idea sparked in Caleb's mind, an idea that he knew Eleanor would embrace. He decided to use the money they had saved, the money she had intended to use to rebuild their life, to establish a schoolhouse in Redemption Gulch. He hired a local carpenter to build a small wooden structure, and he stocked it with books and supplies. He found a young woman, a former teacher from back east, who was willing to come to Redemption Gulch and teach the children. When Eleanor returned a year later, she was surprised to find Caleb waiting for her, not on the farm, but at the edge of Redemption Gulch. He told her about the schoolhouse, about the children, about his vision for a better future for the town. Eleanor listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears. She knew that Caleb had made the right decision. This was her calling, her destiny. "This is it, isn't it?" she said, her voice choked with emotion. "This is where I belong." Caleb nodded, his heart overflowing with love and pride. "It is," he said. "This is your redemption, Eleanor." He watched as she rode towards the schoolhouse, her back straight, her eyes shining with purpose. He knew that she was finally home. He turned his horse and rode away, back towards the farm, back towards the life they had built together. He knew that their paths might diverge, that they might never be together again. But he also knew that their love would endure, that their spirits would always be connected. He rode off into the sunset, a solitary figure against the vast expanse of the west. The air was filled with the scent of sagebrush and the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. It was a wild, unforgiving land, but it was also a land of hope, of opportunity, of redemption. And as Caleb rode, he knew that he would always carry a piece of Eleanor with him, a reminder of her courage, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the power of the human spirit. The West was wild, but within it, a seed of hope had been sown, a promise of a better future for the children of Redemption Gulch. And that, he knew, was a legacy worth more than any gold. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, as Caleb guided his horse back towards the cabin. The silence of the approaching dusk was a heavy blanket, thicker than usual after Eleanor's departure. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet hum of her industry, the soft cadence of her voice as she read to the children. Now, only the wind whispered through the tall grass, a mournful song that echoed the emptiness in his heart. He dismounted in front of the small cabin, the familiar creak of the wooden door, a welcome sound. The scent of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air, a comforting reminder of home. He fed the chickens, milked the cow, and tended to the small vegetable garden. His movements automatic, ingrained by years of habit. The chores offered a temporary respite from the gnawing loneliness, a tangible connection to the land and the rhythm of life. Later, as darkness enveloped the valley, he sat on the porch, staring out at the star-studded sky. The vastness of the universe, the sheer immensity of time and space, dwarfed his own troubles, putting them into perspective. He thought of Eleanor, traveling alone across the unforgiving landscape, facing an uncertain future. He prayed for her safety, for her strength, for her eventual return. The next morning, after a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits, Caleb saddled his horse and rode towards the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a neglected patch of ground, dotted with weathered wooden crosses and overgrown weeds. He dismounted in front of a simple grave, marked with a crudely carved inscription. Thomas, beloved brother. He knelt down, pulling the weeds that choked the grave. He cleared away the debris, smoothing the earth with his calloused hands. Then, from a burlap sack tied to his saddle, he retrieved a handful of wildflower seeds. They were a mix of colors, blues, yellows, reds, and whites, a vibrant contrast to the stark landscape. He scattered the seeds over the grave, a silent offering of remembrance. It was a small act, a simple gesture, but it was all he could do. He stood there for a long moment, gazing at the grave, his heart filled with a complex mix of emotions, grief, regret, and a lingering sense of guilt. He had failed to protect Thomas, had failed to prevent his death. Now all he could do was honor his memory, to try to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small bird perched on a nearby fence post. It was a meadowlark, its bright yellow breast a splash of color against the drab surroundings. It sang a cheerful melody, a song of hope and renewal. Caleb smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He knew that Thomas would have appreciated the wildflowers, the bird's song. He knew that he would have wanted him to move on, to find peace, to live a full and happy life. He mounted his horse and rode back towards town, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He had a schoolhouse to build, children to teach, a future to create. He had a promise to keep, to Eleanor and to himself. The years passed, and the schoolhouse flourished. Eleanor's influence permeated every corner of the small building, her spirit evident in the children's eagerness to learn, in their newfound sense of hope and possibility. Caleb visited often, helping with repairs, reading stories, and offering a quiet, steady presence. He never forgot Eleanor, never stopped loving her. He received occasional letters, brief updates on her travels, her work, her life. She had found her calling, helping the less fortunate, advocating for justice, and spreading her message of compassion and forgiveness. She never returned to Redemption Gulch, but she remained a constant presence in Caleb's life, a guiding star, a source of inspiration. He knew that she was happy, that she was fulfilling her destiny. And that was enough. One evening, as Caleb sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset, he reflected on the events of his life. He had witnessed violence, injustice, and loss. He had made mistakes, had committed sins. But he had also found love, forgiveness, and redemption. He had learned that the West was a harsh and unforgiving land, a place where survival was a constant struggle. But it was also a land of beauty, of opportunity, of endless possibilities. It was a place where even the most hardened soul could find solace, where even the smallest act of kindness could make a difference. The land endured, he thought, its silent witness to the ebb and flow of human drama. It was a land that demanded respect, a land that tested the limits of human endurance. But it was also a land that offered a chance for renewal, a chance for a fresh start. He looked out at the wildflowers that now covered Thomas's grave, a vibrant tapestry of color against the somber landscape. They were a testament to the enduring power of hope, a reminder that even in the dust, beauty could bloom. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. He had found his peace, his purpose. He had found his redemption, not in revenge or retribution, but in offering mercy to another. And in that quiet act, he had finally found himself. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers, and the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. The West was wild, untrained, and forever unforgiving. But in the heart of one weathered cowboy, a Kate's mercy had taken root, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The land remembers. But mercy mercy redeems.